Welcome to episode 111 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Ray Holcomb, who served in the FBI for nearly 23 years. His bureau assignments involved espionage, counter-narcotics, national security, and special weapons and tactics, and took him across America, the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Africa. In this episode, Ray Holcomb discusses FBI hero and legend John O'Neill and the work he did in Yemen with fellow agent Ali Soufan on the USS Cole bombing and 9/11 investigations. Both John O'Neill and Ali Soufan are featured in the Hulu TV series, The Looming Tower. While assigned to the New York office, Ray Holcomb was appointed commander of the 50-member FBI New York SWAT team. Under his leadership, the team assumed an expanded role, and in addition to regular involvement in high-risk domestic arrest, the team provided overseas security and enhanced investigative capability for the FBI teams deploying in response to terrorist attacks involving U.S. citizens. Post 9/11, Ray Holcomb was selected by then Director Mueller to stand up a new counterterrorism unit named the FBI Flyaway Rapid Deployment Team. During the course of his career as a counterterrorism investigator, Ray established extensive relationships with foreign police and intelligence services, and after retiring from the FBI, he worked for 8 years as a strategic planner with the National Counterterrorism Center, NCTC, and for 4 years as a state of Delaware Homeland Security advisor. He currently serves as a consultant to the federal government on terrorism and other national security matters. Ray Holcomb is the author of Endless Enemies, Inside FBI Counterterrorism, in which he writes about leading the FBI's elite cadre of counterterrorism agents who were at the helm of every major post-9/11 investigation. I really enjoyed speaking with Ray. I did not have the pleasure or honor of meeting John O'Neill, and in watching The Looming Tower, I felt a need to learn more about him, and Ray was able to fulfill that need. And I was also very impressed with what he had to say about Ali Soufan. So if you're watching The Looming Tower, you're going to absolutely enjoy this episode. But before we get to it, I just want to make sure to invite you to join my reader team, where once a month I email a digest of the previous month's podcast episodes, my crime fiction recommendations, and I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. My April email features a post on the opportunity I had to meet FBI Director Christopher Wray. To join my reader team, all you need to do is to go to my website, jerrywilliams.com, and sign up when you see the pop-up, or go to my Facebook author page, Jerry Williams Author, and you'll see the sign-up button there. When you join my reader team, you'll get the FBI Reading Resource, which is a list of books about the FBI written by the FBI agents who have been featured on this podcast. Ray Holcomb's book is there, in addition to nearly 35 others. And of course, my book, Pay to Play, is there too. I don't do Patreon, nor do I have ads on this podcast. But if you want to support the show, you can do so by buying a copy of Pay to Play for yourself or someone you know who loves crime fiction. One last thing. Don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Now here's the show.
I am excited to introduce my guest, Ray Holcomb. Hey, Ray.
Hi, Jerry. I'm happy to be on the phone with you.
Great. I am happy that you're here. I think this episode is going to be fascinating for anyone interested in how the Bureau moved from a mostly law enforcement agency to an intelligence gathering agency because you were right there in the thick of things when we made that transition.
I was. As I've thought many times, my career resembled that Forrest Gump story, always popping up in some unique place at some unique time. So yes, I was at the center of most of that.
Well, I was in the Bureau during that time too, that pre-9/11, and then I left in 2008. And by the time I left, I kind of looked back at the Bureau, realizing that I was leaving a Bureau that was much different than the one that I had joined. I did it almost with nostalgia, but it sounds like you actually embraced and welcomed the new direction for the FBI.
I did, and maybe I'll fast forward and put a sharp point on that. I was in Sana'a, Yemen on 9/11, and I was part of the investigation of the USS Cole bombing. I was deployed from the New York Field Division, and our office was within 4 blocks of the World Trade Center. And we arrived in Sana'a literally 2 days before 9/11. We were advised by the ambassador on that morning that the World Trade Center had been attacked. The initial report we received was that they estimated 40,000 people died. Of course, that was incorrect. Thankfully, that was incorrect. But a few hours later, we learned that our boss, John O'Neill, had died in the World Trade Center. And some other associates, close associates, FBI associates had died in the World Trade Center. So it was very important to me to see how we could change things in an effort to stop that from happening again.
Well, usually on this show, I concentrate on a case, but I think we're going to change things up a little bit because you have such a unique inside look at the FBI and some of the counterterrorism tactical units and the organizations within the FBI. You also have a unique look at John O'Neill. And of course, we're talking about John O'Neill and FBI agent Ali Soufan because they are prominently featured in the streaming service Hulu's new original series, The Looming Tower. So this is a great opportunity for those who are watching to be able to learn more about the real John O'Neill and Ali Soufan because you knew them.
Yes.
So I want to talk about that too. So we've got a lot to cover today. And of course, I want to remind everyone that everything that we're going to talk about today is in your book, Endless Enemies, Inside FBI Counterterrorism. So if they're looking for more details, they definitely want to pick up a copy of Endless Enemies. So where do you want to start?
All right, Jerry, let me begin with my arrival in the New York Field Division. I was transferred to New York from the Atlanta Division. I was my first office was the Athens, Georgia Resident Agency, 2-man operation. I grew up in the shadow of New York City. I grew up in northern New Jersey. So when I went to Georgia, it was a real cultural change for me. I liked the work in the 2-man office. You're independent to some degree. You had to have a lot of initiative to go out in the field and solve cases or track down leads. But ultimately, I was transferred to the New York office. I was assigned to a Soviet foreign counterintelligence squad, and I worked Soviet counterintelligence for about 2.5, almost 3 years. I enjoyed it. Not every agent liked it, but I enjoyed it. And then I lobbied for and got transferred to this counter-narcotics squad, C-25, which had developed a reputation as being a real aggressive, really knock 'em dead kind of a squad. They had a couple major cases. Asian heroin was flowing into America through Canada primarily. While I was on that squad, I think they had the 2 largest heroin seizures in the history of not just the FBI, but in the history of counter-narcotics effort across the board. We did some great work. And while I was on that squad, I was asked to try out for the FBI SWAT team in New York. And I was accepted on the SWAT team. and became a member of FBI SWAT, which you know is an ancillary job to your regular day job. So, whether you're an investigator or you're doing admin work or you're a trainer, then you're also, if you're selected, you're also a SWAT team member, and, you participate in that training and the call-outs whenever the SWAT team is called out on a mission. So I did that for a total of 14 years. At the end, I was appointed as the SWAT team leader for the New York office. New York was what they called, or still is, an enhanced SWAT team. The Bureau designated a handful of major field offices as enhanced SWAT teams, which meant they gave you more funding and more resources and more training so you could create a bigger team. In New York, we had 45 SWAT operators and 3 medics.
Could you explain for everyone what the difference is between an enhanced SWAT team and the FBI's HRT?
Yes, I can. Which is a great question. HRT is full time. I mean, HRT, that's what they do, 5, 6, 7 days a week. They train, they're based in Quantico. They train all around the world. They train with all of the high-speed special operations groups in the military, and with some of our foreign counterparts, special operations teams. They get the best training there is for a domestic or a civilian, a SWAT team. They get the best training that there is. None like it. Now, with an enhanced team in the field, New York was an enhanced team, WFO, I think Houston and LA. Not only do you get the funding to equip and train an additional 30 SWAT operators, but you also get additional training opportunities. The normal SWAT team, and again, I'm going back 20 years ago, is allotted one training day a month, where you're paid to go to the range and shoot all your weapons and qualify with all your weapons. Then we would get two weeks a year, which we would split up between spring and fall, where we could pick a training venue, create a training opportunity that had to be approved by SERG. For instance, from New York, we had some contacts in the military special operations community. So we had some great opportunities to train down at Fort Bragg. I won't specifically say who we trained with, but, the best of the best. And, Air Force Pararescue, we did some survival training with them. We did survival training with, Marine Recon down in Lejeune. We would do some really high speed training. But the bottom line is that HRT, what they do is train all the time for the next mission. With an enhanced SWAT team or any SWAT team, you train as much as you can, but your primary job is, to work on a squad and work investigations, or you might be, on an administrative division where you're doing training or something else. But that's your primary mission, and SWAT is secondary. So, does that help?
Yeah. Let me take a moment to define some of the acronyms that you've been dropping.
Sure.
SERG is the Critical Incident Response Group.
Correct.
HRT is, of course, the Hostage Rescue Team.
Correct.
And WFO is the Washington Field Office. It's in Washington, D.C. It is the field office, and which is different than FBI headquarters.
Correct.
All right. So you're in New York. You've moved from the Foreign Counterintelligence Squad now to a drug squad, and you're on the SWAT team.
Yes. So we're busy, and it certainly wasn't white collar business hours. I mean, you didn't go and work 9 to 5. Usually, as you can imagine, if you're working counter-narcotics, you're working evenings, you're working weekends, you're working around the clock for 24, sometimes 48 hours, and then you're always subject to a no-notice SWAT call-out. So you get that call, and, SWAT team has to rally in the basement 26 Federal Plaza at midnight tonight. You get that call, you get out of your day clothes, and you get into your tactical clothes, and you meet up downstairs. It was a volunteer position. People did it because they wanted to do it, because they liked doing it. No one was forced to do it. I'm speaking in regard to SWAT. No one was forced to do it. It was a busy lifestyle, very busy lifestyle.
So when did you move into counterterrorism?
Well, this is interesting, and it kind of segues my involvement with SWAT and how it segues into counterterrorism. The New York Field Division, there were some case agents, and I don't want to exclude anybody, so I won't say the names that I remember. There were a handful of case agents who were really top-notch counterterrorism agents. I mean, this is before counterterrorism was really on the top of everyone's list. Early on, through the use of a wiretap, I believe, they identified a number of people talking about the base, which in Arabic is Al-Qaeda. This was in the early 90s. And of course, we had the World Trade Center bombing, the first World Trade Center bombing, and Ramzi Yousef was behind that. It took us a little while to pin down the planner, and then we identified Ramzi Yousef as being a member of this fledgling group, Al-Qaeda. And early, I think it was, and again, I could be off, but I think in 95, 96, that squad, those agents, got an indictment against Osama bin Laden as the titular leader of this vague group known as Al-Qaeda. So in the Southern District of New York, the FBI obtained an arrest warrant for Osama bin Laden early on, very early on. So after we had the embassy bombings, 98 I believe, we suspected that Al-Qaeda was behind the embassy bombings. We deployed the Foreign Emergency Support Team. The Bureau created standalone rapid deployment teams, deployed them to Nairobi, and deployed another one to Dar es Salaam. I was on the team that deployed to Dar es Salaam, and a number of us had a dual role early on. We were experienced investigators, maybe not terrorism investigators, but we were experienced investigators, and we were also SWAT operators, so we could provide a security element to the overall investigative team. This became routine. As New York office deployed more and more to overseas terrorism incidents, they would take along a handful of experienced SWAT operators who were also good backup investigators. This was in the late 90s. I was in charge of there were 3 teams in New York. Eventually I became the head of the Manhattan team, which was 15 to 18 operators. And I saw early on that the direction that New York SWAT was going. We were in a city where you have a police department of 40,000 people. And yes, the FBI SWAT team got called out on many missions, but it wasn't as if New York City couldn't handle a lot of these things on their own. But I saw that as international terrorism became more and more of a growing threat, and as FBI teams were going to have to deploy more and more to crime scenes, that the FBI SWAT team role, at least for New York, was going to change. And that we had to be more nimble, we had to be more prepared to, sitting on your bag, ready to go on a moment's notice and deploy overseas. In most of these cases, we were allowed to bring our weapons and carry our weapons in most of these third world countries. So,
could you explain why that's significant, that you were allowed to carry your weapons?
Yeah, it's very significant because it will reverse this and imagine that some nationals from another country, let's say some French nationals, were attacked and killed in New Orleans, and the French wanted to send over an investigative team, and they wanted their investigators to carry sidearms and maybe even M4 rifles. And could you imagine the reaction? The U.S. government would never allow that. Most governments in the world would not allow that. However, a lot of these attacks were taking place in third world countries where they welcomed our assistance because they were so strapped for resources. They couldn't even guarantee, and they would say to us, and these investigations were always spearheaded by State Department, but they would say to State Department, we cannot guarantee the safety of your FBI people if they come here to work these cases. The next question then was, would you allow our FBI people to carry their weapons? And oftentimes we were allowed to. So here we were in another country, packing our weapons. We'd be discreet about it. We made every effort to conceal our weapons, but we were armed. Depending upon where we were going, we would wear body armor. We would often set up our own repeater towers so that our handheld radios worked. Yeah, so we were standalone. We were almost like you could almost equate us to a small field division. We'd go out, we had commo people. We'd always have a doctor. We'd have, support people running our CP. And we always did it in liaison with the host country's police officers and intelligence people. We always worked side by side. So I could see, getting back to where I was going, is that I could see the mission of the SWAT team changing dramatically as international terrorism became more and more of a threat. So we began to focus on what we needed to operate overseas, the inoculations, the physicals, making sure everybody was healthy. It's a different environment overseas. I had, numbers of operators get sick. Big, strong, healthy men end up on IVs for days, simply because you're exposed to a whole different set of germs. I don't know how else to say it, So we would have to prepare our people for an overseas environment. Again, it was voluntary. Not everybody was willing to go. Not everyone was willing to do it. So anyway, what happened was the USS Cole was attacked in Aden Harbor in October of 2000. It was attacked by a shipborne suicide mission explosion. 17 sailors were killed, 43 were wounded, and the FBI gathered up a rapid deployment team out of the New York office, again because we had filed the indictment on Osama bin Laden, and very quickly we determined that this had been an attack that had been ordered by UBL. Gathered up a large team. In this case, I'll never forget this. This takes me to John O'Neill. I remember as the SWAT team commander, I was helping the team logistically gather up everything because we would deploy out of McGuire Air Base in New Jersey. I remember going down to McGuire as the FBI group from New York gathered the night before they were going to deploy on military transport. And John was there because this mission fell under his division in New York. He had been told by SERG that HRT was going to provide the security element for this deployment. And of course, SWAT operators have a lot of pride. So I remember saying to John, he and I walked over to the corner of the room and I said, John, I'm a little disappointed that you didn't have enough faith in your SWAT team to handle the security mission. And he looked me in the eye and he said, and he was right. And he said, Ray, he goes, this is way above you guys. He said, we don't have the resources in New York to do this. It's got to be out of SERG. And he explained a few things, and I understood that. But the very fact that he spent 10 minutes with me to explain why he was bringing along HRT to protect the investigation as opposed to the New York Field Division Enhanced SWAT team, that impressed me. The fact that he took the time and he cogently explained why, and he was right.
I think this is the second time that we've mentioned John O'Neill. I mentioned him earlier in the introduction, and, you're talking about him now. We might want to give people a little idea of who John O'Neill was before we continue on with this case review.
Okay. John recognized early this threat known as Al-Qaeda, and he was one of the first in the FBI to realize the severity of that threat. And, you know, a lot of what he was preaching, I understand, was falling on deaf ears, and particularly down at headquarters. But at some point, John really understood that there was a threat from this extremist group known as the Base, or known as Al-Qaeda, and that bin Laden was probably the leader. And at that time in New York, as in most field divisions, there were very, very few Arabic-speaking agents. Very few. And Arabic-speaking agents and Muslim agents. John spotted Ali Soufan early, and I'm not quite sure what squad Ali was on, but John spotted Ali and recognized his talents and took him under his wing, so to speak. He relied heavily on Ali's knowledge of Islam, Ali's ability to speak Arabic, and Ali had a great personality. It still does, I understand. He was an outgoing, affable, likable young man. So John brought him in under his wing and relied heavily on Ali in all matters dealing with Middle Eastern extremism. John was I can't call him an FBI bureaucrat. He was not a bureaucrat. John was unique. John had a fairly meteoric rise in the FBI. I think he started out in the Chicago field office, spent some time in Washington field office before he arrived in the New York field office. He was in charge of counterintelligence and terrorism when he arrived in the New York office. I worked for him in two different capacities because I worked on a special project in addition to SWAT, and this was after I'd been on the drug squad, so I got to know John fairly well. John was passionate about his work. He was passionate about the FBI, and he was passionate about everything he worked on. He was 110% blue and gold. And the interesting thing was that to a lot of us, this is my personal opinion, and I think some other agents I've talked to share it, he was a street agent's agent. We felt that he always had our back. We felt that he truly did know what we were up against and what we were trying to do, and that he appreciated it. Now, for him to convey that feeling among the troops, so to speak, and still pursue and he pursued it very aggressively, his climb up the FBI ladder is pretty amazing. Oftentimes, you're either one or the other. You can't be both. You can't be a street agent, and a bureaucratic looking to enhance your career up the ladder. Oftentimes, you can't be both. It's too transparent. But John, and I do believe he was sincere, he would put his arm around you, and he'd make you feel like you're the only person in the room. It was John's retirement luncheon, his retirement party. I ran up. I was on the street, heading a executive protection detail for the FBI New York. I got there late. John was the only one in the room, and the photographer had packed his case, and I came in and said, Mr. O'Neill, I'm so sorry. I wanted to make you lunch and wish him luck. He looked over at the photographer and said, pull that camera out. He had to open up his case, put his camera back together, and take this one last picture, what I do believe the one last picture, John O'Neill. And snapped that picture. It's a picture I still have on my desk. A big smile. He had his arm around me like he was trying to get my vote. and that was it. And I never saw him again. About a week later, when I was in Yemen, I heard that he had died. But that was John's style. But I also heard stories about you didn't want to be a mid-level manager working for John, because he could be pretty tough.
Pretty demanding?
Demanding, yes. And certainly I don't think he had any patience with anyone not making him look good. Here's a great story. This is one of my favorite, Jerry. When I was working on this special project, every month John would get a briefing on the progress of the special project. And at this point in time, I don't think I'd ever had more than 3 words with him. So I'm called into the room, my boss's office. And my boss, took a seat in the rear of the room and sat there quietly. And my boss attempted to brief John on my project. And he didn't do a very good job. You know, he didn't have the details. He didn't know the project like I did, of course. The whole time my boss was talking to John had his head down and he was reviewing cables and telephone. He never once looked up at my boss. Never once. So after about 15 minutes of a fairly inept attempt to explain my case, John raised his head and he turned around. I didn't even know he knew I was in the room. He turned around, he looked at me, and he said, "Okay, Ray, now you tell me about your case." And he listened intently, and I told him about my case. That really impressed me. And he listened to everything I said, and he asked some really good questions. But he asked me because he knew I was the person on the street. You know, I had hands on. I was doing the operation. And he knew I was the source. I was the one to go to for the real story.
What I think is significant for people that are listening is that the Bureau really has a military foundation, and chain of command is very important. And so he gave the respect to your supervisor, to let your supervisor do a briefing, because to ask you immediately would have been disrespectful of that chain. But then after he had his turn, he went to the person who really knew what they were talking about.
Right. Yeah, that was John. So,
well, let me ask you a couple of questions about John O'Neill, because I did not have the pleasure or the honor of meeting him, but I have been watching The Looming Tower, which is the new series on Hulu. And I tell you, we've got a lot of characters. When TV shows and books and movies talk about the FBI, they always show the agent as being so robotic and stiff and no personality. And the one thing I know for sure is we've got some unbelievable characters in the FBI. And it sounds like John was one of those characters. In the TV show, they had him using profanity as if it was a second language.
I think he could selectively turn it on, yes. I think he could use profanity for emphasis or incentive. I think customarily in mixed company, in a normal social setting, he didn't do that. But I think he could easily turn it on when it was needed. John was very proud of the fact that he came from a blue-collar Irish family, Atlantic City, New Jersey. He used to talk a lot about his grandfather was a famous saloon piano player. So, you know, he wasn't an Ivy League elitist at all, and he was proud of the fact. He dressed very, what's the term? Very good dresser. Yeah, always dressed sharp. J. Edgar would have been proud. He always had the knotted tie pulled tight. He looked the part. He always looked the part, but he had a sense of humor. He had a wry sense of humor. And yes, could he use profanity? He certainly could. And he used to hold court at a place called Elaine's. You've probably heard all about that, uptown in Manhattan. It was a favorite cocktail lounge of his. I think I was only in there once, and certainly I was not at the special table. But he would hold court there, they say, every night, meet with his counterparts from other agencies. He loved his job. He loved life. He loved the action, and he never would have, that he was PNG'd by Ambassador Bodine in Yemen. She she basically threw him out. He was unique. I think there were many, many characters. Yes, Jerry, there were certainly not robots. There were many, many characters with special personalities. They all have one thing in common, though. They loved the job. I think that's what they had in common. They all were there, not for the money. They were there because they loved the work. They were passionate about the work.
Can you share the story about him being thrown out of the country? Is that something that's publicly known?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's very publicly known.
Well, I haven't heard it.
Okay, well, he led the deployment, the first deployment, the one I told you about, where he told me why HRT was going to provide the security element instead of SWAT, FBI SWAT New York. He went as the on-scene commander after the USS Cole was blown up. He went to Aden, Yemen, and served as the on-scene commander to oversee the investigation. He was there for about a month or so, I think, before he fell crosswise with Ambassador Bodine. They had a different view as to how the investigation should be handled. He pushed aggressively, he pushed hard, and of course she was State Department, and she had to take into consideration the nations, their sensitivities and their feelings, and their reluctance to cooperate or not to cooperate. So she had to walk a finer line. I'll give you an example. She at first insisted that FBI agents not wear weapons. Well, it was a very hostile place. It was a very hostile place. And John pushed back and said, no, we won't conduct this unless my people are armed. Then she wouldn't allow the FBI to conduct solo interviews or interrogations without it being handled by someone from State Department. She wanted a State Department officer to sit in the middle and pass questions, approve questions, pass questions back and forth. And John said, no, we're not going to do that. So it reached a boiling point to where the ambassador reached back to Washington. I guess our director Free, they finally said, John, you got to come home. This is not working. So in State Department parlance, John was PNG'd out of Yemen, not allowed to come back. And it bothered him immensely, because he was committed to that investigation. He was committed to finding the culprits, tracking them down and bringing them to justice. And the fact that the State Department tried to tie one of our hands behind our back while we were there, just drove him over the edge, I think.
Some people may not know the acronym persona non grata.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
The Bureau is a big acronym place. And so many times I get emails or comments from listeners who say, I don't know what you're talking about, so I'm trying to be a little bit more conscious of what we say. So persona non grata.
I'll try harder to spell them out. So John he loved getting his hands dirty. He was right there at the scene. He wanted to be involved in every aspect of that investigation. But he crossed wires with the ambassador, and that was the end of that. He still closely monitored developments from back in New York after he was sent home.
So once John O'Neill comes back from Yemen after being kicked out of the country, is that when he starts looking into possibly retiring?
Yes. I think that and everything you read about John, and I think it's portrayed in the books, John had ruffled more than a few feathers high up in the FBI. He made some mistakes, and I imagine those mistakes were coming back to haunt him. And I think he concluded that any future possibility of promotion was over. And he remained very, very much involved in the investigation into the USS Cole. I think he had many conversations with the parents of those sailor victims, and he felt very, responsible for concluding that investigation. And when he retired, my memory is when he retired, the day before he retired, which was, late August of 2001, he reauthorized the investigation in Yemen into the bombing of the USS Cole. I think that was one of his last acts before he walked out the door.
When you said he made some mistakes, would those be basically power moves that didn't pan out?
Probably more than that, and it's all pretty well documented, Jerry. There was the story about him accidentally leaving classified information in a briefcase at a conference in Florida, and he had to report that. They ultimately found the information, and they were able to conclude no one had tampered with it because, I don't know, they claimed that they took fingerprints off the documents, but that was just a culmination. That was just the last straw on the back of the camel. He had and again, this is all well documented, he had a girlfriend, and he had misused a government car, and he had apparently allowed her to use a bathroom facility at a sensitive location. And this was all reported. And it was just, the file was building on John. And I think he recognized that his career was coming to an end. Plus the fact, and I think this is all well documented. I think financially, he was in some dire straits, and the position at the World Trade Center was going to pay a heck of a lot more than what the FBI was paying him. He was supporting a wife who was living down in South Jersey. And I think he had at least one child or two. He was not divorced. So he's paying support. He's living in Manhattan, which is certainly no cheap place to live. And I think he had just reached the end where he realized that financially he couldn't continue, and that enough of a file had been built on him that those who didn't want to see him rise up were in a position to stop it. But again, that's pretty well documented. Just about everything you'll read about him, you'll read that.
Well, what a eerie irony it was that he would take this job at the World Trade Center.
Yes.
And within a month or less than 2 months, be dead, based on the fact that he was now head of security there.
Yes, the greatest irony in my career is that here's a man who supposedly, the man who knew, the man who raised the red flag on Al-Qaeda back in the 90s, in the mid to early 90s, when nobody was very interested. That in the end, you could say in the end, Al-Qaeda got him. Al-Qaeda took him out.
Wow, I had to sit with that for a little bit.
Yeah. I thought about that often. Very ironic.
So could you tell us more about your role in the Yemen investigation, in the Cole investigation? Another person that is portrayed in the TV show The Looming Tower was there with you, Ali Soufan, Special Agent Ali Soufan. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about the deployment of SWAT along with HRT and what your role was?
HRT was there for weeks and weeks, and I think after a couple of months, maybe not quite a couple of months, they realized that they were overexposing themselves, because if something else had happened anywhere in the world, they had basically most of their contingent in Aden, Yemen. And again, remember, they are primarily an FBI hostage response team, so that if anything had happened back in the U.S., they wouldn't be around. So after a couple of months, they said, okay, we can no longer sustain this deployment. Who can replace us? And of course, the FBI New York FBI team, SWAT team stepped up. But in this case, we were only allowed to bring, initially it was myself and 2 other SWAT operators. So we went from an HRT contingent of 2 to 3 dozen to 3 FBI SWAT guys that would ride shotgun, so to speak, every day as we would travel into the city to conduct interrogations of suspects and witnesses. So we went from this high level of security to this modicum of security.
Did the threat change?
The threat did not change. But here's an element that I shouldn't leave out. The MU, the Marine Expeditionary Unit, which was based in, I think, the Indian Ocean, arrived early on while HRT was there and provided, I think it's a battalion of Marines to provide security for our investigation. They occupied the hotel, which was the Golden Mohur Hotel, which was right on the coast. We set up a perimeter defense. We had Marines on the roof. We had Marines everywhere in the building. But the Marines were not allowed to leave the compound. So that when we had to take our investigators into the city of Aden to meet with the Yemenis and to interrogate suspects, it was just myself and 2 of my SWAT operators. We were armed, but we were in soft-skin vehicles. They weren't armored. And what we would do is there were only so many routes into town. And typically, what you do to keep the enemy off balance is you change up your routine. You take different routes at different times of the day, try to change vehicles, and we did all that. In the end, we realized, the drivers were contract drivers that were hired by the State Department. They were Yemeni men who were from northeast Yemen, not from the Aden area. Seemed like nice enough fellas. And in the end, what we would do, we fell back on what we called the canary in the mine trigger, and we would watch our drivers. Our drivers, I think, would live in town, and I had no doubt that if there was, a possibility of an ambush, that the drivers would probably be aware of it. So if the drivers called in sick, said we're not, one of them said I'm not driving today, or if the drivers got nervous, we'd watch them while they were driving. We'd watch their eyes, watch them constantly checking their side view mirrors, rear view mirrors. That for us was a signal that it was not a good time to drive into town. So we would cancel the trip if any one of us suspected that there was trouble coming.
Wow. And
that's how we operated. There were some days when, there were signs that we may have avoided ambushes or that the Al-Qaeda Yemen was coming to get us. We're always sensitive to that. Eventually the investigation moved from Aden to Sana'a on the other side of the country. That hotel, by the way, the Golden Mohur, had been bombed a few years prior when some U.S. Marines were transiting through there on the way to the Gulf. I think some group, it may have been Al-Qaeda, had set off a bomb at that hotel some years prior to us staying there. Yeah, so that's how we functioned. We would mix up our routes. We would try to low-key it. We would try to dress so that we somewhat blended, let the facial hair grow in, the typical Yemeni scarf around your head, keep the weapons low, although, ironically, you can drive around the city in Yemen and half the young men in town are carrying AK-47s. So...
Well, that's scary.
Well, it is what it is, though, so that a weapon was not necessarily a signal or a flag that you were alien or some kind of intruder, because everybody was carrying a weapon. So that's how we functioned for a while. At one point, the claim was that the threat level had gotten so bad that we had received intelligence in some form that was never specifically shared with the street soldiers like me, what the intelligence was, that it was time to pull up chocks and leave Aden.
How long had the FBI been there? Because the bombing of the Cole the USS Cole occurred sometime in 2000.
Right, it was October 12th, and the FBI left there, I think it was January of 2001. So we were there about 3 months, and then they said, no, threat level's too high, we're gonna pull up, we're gonna leave. Now, and this is just me, I think what happened was we were getting so little cooperation from the U.S. State Department that I think a decision was made back home that under the current State Department administration in Yemen, we're going to get nowhere, so we're bringing our people home. Now, what I think buttresses that opinion is that we left lock, stock, and barrel. We returned to Yemen. This time we flew into Sana'a. I was part of this team. We flew into Sana'a the same day that Ambassador Bodine, the same ambassador who had thrown John O'Neill out of the country, flew out of Sana'a. As her plane left, we landed. We reinstituted the investigation. And of course, as you know, it was only within a week that 9/11 occurred, and things took a different course.
So having that change was probably instrumental in doing the work that you needed to do once 9/11 happened. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you if we can talk about what the FBI was trying to accomplish in the Yemen investigation, in the Cole investigation. What are you trying to find out? Because it's my understanding that the actual bombing was a suicide attack.
The two operators blew themselves up, and later on we identified who they were. We were after the masterminds, and I think the one mastermind, Nashiri, was his last name. He is currently sitting in Guantanamo. We eventually caught him, and I don't know if we caught him. I can't recall if we caught him in the United Arab Emirates or somewhere else. But he worked directly under orders from Osama bin Laden. So in the process of our investigation, we had some great people there. Ali Soufan was a great FBI agent who did a tremendous job. We had some great people from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Bob McFadden, he worked very closely with Ali. Ali was an Arabic-speaking agent, young Arabic-speaking agent, who was masterful when it came to conducting interrogations. Masterful. And we eventually, or they eventually, identified most of the organization that plotted, planned, and carried out the attack on the USS Cole, leading to indictments and arrest warrants. And I think we probably got the ones that didn't die, the ones that were not taken out in drone strikes. I think Badawi and Shiri, I think we've got both of them. Now, Badawi, every time we identified one of the key players to the Yemenis would arrest them, and within a matter of months, they'd escape prison. I think Badawi escaped twice, and I'm not sure what happened with him ultimately. I think he might have been killed. Nashiri is still in Guantanamo Bay Detention Center. His case has been on and off and on and off and on and off for over 10 years. So what we did was, through the really great work of those two investigators and several others, we tracked down, we put together a picture of who plotted and planned the attack, how it was carried out, and who the culprits were. And then we put them on a worldwide bolo, be on the lookout for, and eventually ran most of them to ground. An interesting sideline to this is that the previous, on the millennium, a year before, a little bit more than a year before, U.S. intelligence had picked up signals indicating that there was going to be an attack on a U.S. Navy vessel. in that part of the world. I and a group from New York deployed on, they call it the FEST. It's led by the State Department, Foreign Emergency Support Team, something like that. Please don't hold me to the acronym. It's been a long time. But it's a big, all-inclusive joint task force comprised of members of the FBI and all the other intelligence agencies, the military, and you just name it, just about everybody you can think of. They flew us all over to Ramstein, Germany, right before the millennium, because they were dead certain that there was going to be a major terrorist incident targeting the U.S. interests somewhere in the world on the millennium. Well, the millennium came and went, and there was no attack, so we flew back to the U.S. only to find out months and months later that the original shipborne attack had been planned for the millennium in southern Yemen, and the USS the Sullivans, another U.S. Navy frigate destroyer, was the target of that attack. We even eventually found the boat that was used to plot and was going to use to blow up the USS the Sullivans. However, it turned out what happened, the seas were choppy that day, and the boat was overladen with explosives, and it swamped, and it never made it out to where the Sullivans was at anchor in the harbor.
Wow. What's significant about that is I hear that they're very persistent, and as something is planned and it doesn't work out, that they'll initiate it at another time. So this is an example of that.
Perfect example. They have somebody wrote a book about, well, we have 1,000 years to get the job done. I think the title was, I'm paraphrasing, but it's true. They have no timeline. They have a goal, and they have no exact timeline. But yes, they dragged the boat back into the shore. They had to dry out, I guess, remove the explosives and try to dry them out so they could be reused. But the fact of the matter was that there had been a plot to sink a U.S. Navy vessel on the millennium, and that our intelligence had been correct. They just waited another year, 13 months later, and got the job done. And I actually walked the beach where the first attack boat was launched, because we had informants that actually showed us where the boat had been launched from on that day.
Why don't you talk to us about what it was like to be in Yemen investigating an attack on Americans when 9/11 occurred?
Okay, yeah. That was an incredible time. We arrived in Sana'a and to reinstitute the investigation, reconstitute the investigation into the Cole attack. We spent the first day or two plotting our routes across the city. Again, I had the security detail. This time I had 6 people, 3 diplomatic security agencies, New York SWAT agents. And we were plotting the various routes that we were going to follow to get to the Yemeni prison at night, late at night, to do the interrogations. I remember arriving back at our hotel, the only real hotel in town, which was a Sheraton. Early in the morning after running or casing these routes, my partner put the TV on. It was BBC, and we saw the second plane hit the tower. Like everybody else in America, we knew instantly, because we came from Manhattan. It was a clear day. We knew instantly it was terrorism. So we immediately rallied all our people, got them into one safe location. I accompanied the on-scene commander over to the embassy where we got on the phone. We're sitting with the ambassador and we're hearing this news. And then we heard that John O'Neill is dead. I, like everyone else there immediately, the first thing I did was call my wife because I knew the cell service would go down. We lived in northeast New Jersey. Actually, from where we were living at the time, she could see smoke from lower Manhattan in the sky. We lived near the coast. She could see smoke in the sky. And of course, she told me the same story everyone else told, what the skies were suddenly empty. And nobody knew what was going to happen next. And everyone just rightfully assumed that this was the beginning of more attacks. We immediately pulled our FBI team in from the Sheraton Hotel, pulled them inside the embassy compound, which was fairly well fortified. We got a phone call from FBI headquarters that night saying, we want everybody to get on a plane tomorrow. First plane that you get on, and it happened to be a KLM commercial flight out in the morning, and come home as soon as possible. So we rallied early in the morning. We got a Yemeni escort to the Sana'a airport. We were waiting in a special VIP lounge for our plane to arrive when we got another phone call from FBI headquarters. And I think we only had 2 cell phones that worked internationally. Tommy Donlin, who was the on-scene commander, he was an ASAC from New York. He took the call, could only hear one side. It was yes, we will. He got off the phone and he said, okay, that was headquarters. They want a contingent to stay behind because there are people in prison here in Sana'a that need to be interrogated. Apparently the Yemenis had coughed up these prisoners. They had held back on us. But when they saw what happened in New York and at the Pentagon and Shanksville, they realized America was going to be very angry. So the Yemenis contacted our ambassador and said, we have some people in prison that you really need to talk to. So I stayed behind. One of my SWAT operators volunteered to stay behind. Ali Soufan and Bob McFadden, the NCIS investigator, he stayed behind. Tommy Donlin, and I think a communications person.
Knowing that your family, your coworkers are all in the New York area, all of this is going on, and you are going to volunteer to stay in Yemen. There's a job to be done, yes, but everything that you love is under attack in New York.
Yes. And on top of that, the FBI office in Lower Manhattan had to be closed down because the HVAC, or the air system, became so clogged with debris from the World Trade Center fires and collapse that it was inhabitable. So it's a big office, 1,000 agents, probably 3,000 support people. They had to relocate uptown literally overnight. And the stories are endless about, Air Force fighters buzzing the city and nobody knowing whether they were the enemy or friendly, and no one knowing where to go next, and people walking home and people, just terrified. So, and then talking to my wife and not being able to really explain anything over an open cell phone, but letting her know that she wasn't going to be seeing me for a while and that I hoped she was all right. Fortunately, she had family in New Jersey, but that was small consolation for just about everybody who remembers where they were, particularly the ones who were living on the East Coast on that day. So
absolutely.
So then what we did was, we changed gears, and instead of pursuing the USS Cole investigation, we immediately dove into the interrogation of these individuals that the Yemenis were holding in a very secret facility.
This is a good time for me to bring up something that you had said. And you had said that Agent Ali Soufan was a gifted interviewer.
Yes.
So I take it that this is really where you saw his skills at work.
Oh, yes. He was a very intelligent, very gifted young man. He was very patient. And I think he was of Lebanese descent, but he understood the Middle Eastern mind far better than most any other FBI agents. We only had a handful of Arabic speakers at that time. So he understood how to talk to young Middle Eastern men. And it was amazing to watch. He was patient. at a time when the pressure was on. Everyone thought the next attack was going to happen any minute, and the easy course would have been to resort to extreme measures. We didn't.
Were there other people when you were advised that there were people in custody who might have information about Al-Qaeda and 9/11? Were there other Arabic agents that also went to interview or interrogate these people in custody, or was all of that placed on the shoulders of Ali Soufan?
For the first, I think, and again, I can't recall exactly, but I think for the first few weeks to the first month, it was all Ali Soufan. We had Bob McFadden from NCIS was there. Bob did not speak Arabic. At some point, Andre Corey, another FBI agent, joined us, but I think it was weeks later. Andre was Lebanese, and I believe Andre spoke some Arabic, but it was almost a month later. So for the first few weeks, the really critical weeks, it was all Ali Soufan. Ali used a classic rapport building technique. He made them comfortable. He made them feel like that they were fellow Muslims, spoke a little religion. He shared. Every night we would always bring a bag of treats, whether it was candy or pistachios, and usually we'd bring some kind of fruit juice, which is very popular in that area. So he would put them at ease. He would make them comfortable. And his style, he had a great style of doing that. And then at some point, he got them to start talking about what they did in the training camp in Afghanistan. And then he encouraged them, by, so it was so typical. He encouraged them by talking about how neat it must have been, how exciting it must have been, and how special they were that they had the opportunity to work with the Sheikh, Osama bin Laden. And they fed right into that. They bid on it, and they began to talk and brag and boast about their relationship with the Sheikh, how they were weapons trainers and taught the recruits and the Taliban and how to use weapons. And they just opened up. They became very comfortable and talked freely about it. So at one point, Ali, after the interrogation one night, late at night, he hopped in our vehicle. Like about 2:00 in the morning. And he said, they're ready to identify some of the people who were in the camp who may have been involved in the attack. He said, we need to put together some photo spreads in classic FBI style. So we went back to the embassy. Then the next morning, we paid a visit to the visa office, and we collected a number of visa photos of young Arabic males. And at the same time, we had acquired, I think, through the New York office, visa photos of all the Arabic males who had been on board the hijacked aircraft. Still, at this point, we didn't know positively which of them were involved, but we collected the photos of every Arab male, younger Arab male who had been on the aircraft. So we took those photos, we matched them up against a dozen or so photos that we found in the visa office in the embassy, and we created a photo spread, classic photo spread. Same facial hair, same profile, same way they were facing the camera. If they had a full head of hair, they all had a full head of hair, exactly as we were taught in the academy. So the next night, Ali and Bob, we drove them back to the political security office, and they went in and they were in for a few hours. And what happened, and Ali explained this all later on, is that they began to, have comfortable conversation, shared their pistachios and their grape juice, and then he put out the photo spreads, and he just casually mentioned to the two of them, so do you recognize anybody in these photos? They mulled them over for a few seconds. I don't think there was a long hesitation. And one of the prisoners said, oh, yeah, this guy right here, we recognize this guy right here. And Ali said, oh, really? So why? What's special about him? And he said, well, the Sheikh the sheikh was paid a lot of attention to him, and at one point, one or more times, the sheikh took him to the rear of the tent, and they had a very quiet personal conversation. And then they identified another individual in the photo spread, and they said, yeah, he used to sit at the right hand of the sheikh during dinner, which is a very special place to occupy. So they readily pinpointed two of the hijackers, and they were confident that they were somehow very special to Osama bin Laden. Well, we were pretty excited, to say the least. And that night, as soon as we got back to the embassy, Bob and Ali drafted an email back to the New York office. And in essence, the cable said, we have positive identification of at least two hijackers, and that they were definitely Al-Qaeda, and they were definitely in the Afghanistan training camp before 9/11.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing.
And Jerry, this was literally, to the best of my memory, this was literally 2 weeks after 9/11. And I remember thinking to myself, we have just handed the President of the United States the probable cause necessary or required to invade or attack the training camps in Afghanistan. I remember thinking that this is the evidence that's needed to go after those training camps. And in the court of the world, I mean, you couldn't have done a better job at those identifications. So we sent that all up to New York, and we expected a quick response and an excited response, and it didn't come right away. And I think it may have been the next day, as the sun rose. I was in our little embassy office. I was cleaning things up. Every morning, the Marine Guard would come through and inspect the premises and make sure we hadn't made a mess. So I was in the office cleaning things up, and the phone rang. And I remember picking up the phone, and there was a young lady on the other end, and she said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so. I'm an analyst from FBI headquarters, and we're just curious as to what your team is doing." Now, okay, let me back on that. This must have been a few days later, after we had sent our report up to New York on the positive IDs. So I was a little taken back by her attitude because, part of me I sort of expected a call from someone very senior at FBI headquarters saying, in essence, great job, guys. You just did a great job. Big pat on the back kind of thing. Instead, she said, "What's going on over there?" And I said, "Excuse me?" And she said, "Well, we haven't heard anything in a while." And I said, "Well," and immediately, Jerry, my mind is turning, and I'm realizing probably what took place. So I said to the young analyst, I said, "Well, I think you probably should call the New York office because we have sent a very important report there." And she said, "Thanks," and she hung up.
So there was no sharing of the information?
My opinion is it was slow sharing. It was slow to go down to headquarters.
At this time, every agent in the FBI, practically every FBI agent in the country, had some lead or some aspect of working 9/11. And I know in Philadelphia, I was out in the South Jersey RA, in our Cherry Hill RA, and I was assigned to go throughout the South Jersey region and speak directly with any individual that was originally from any other countries in which the 9/11 hijackers were suspected of originating from, for two purposes: to make sure that we identified everyone and knew where they were and their purpose here in the U.S., and also to reach out and let them know that if they were the victim of any type of backlash or civil rights violations, that the FBI was here to protect their interests too.
Yes, it was a massive effort.
So how long did you actually stay in Yemen after 9/11?
I think, well, we rotated out. I think it was about I was there and one other agent for better part of 2.5 to 3 months. And then two fellows rotated in and replaced us. But the FBI team was there well into 2002. We were working side by side with Naval Criminal Intelligence. So they had their staff there also. But the effort went, I think, into the winter and spring of 2002. I'll never forget the day when I returned, when my partner and I, another SWAT guy and I returned to New York. It was late in the year, and when some agents picked us up out at Kennedy Airport, we drove back in through the Battery Tunnel at the lower end of Manhattan. You could still smell the burning ruins of the Twin Towers. And I'll never forget the sight as we came up out of the tunnel, and all you could see was this twisted wreckage, like gnarled fingers protruding out of the ground where those buildings had been. And it was still months later. The odor still filled the air.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, you've done so much in your career, and we've only touched on this aspect of it. I would be very interested in stopping here for part 1 and picking up and doing part 2, because we haven't gotten to any of the significant involvement that you had in changing the FBI, again, from law enforcement agency to an intelligence gathering agency. I mean, you were involved in the startup of the FBI's flyaway rapid deployment team. You were involved in, setting up some of the operational response and setting up the National Joint Terrorism Task Force. There's so many other things. So can we stop here and do a part 2?
Yeah, sure. Definitely. I'll leave you with this. It was very clear to me we were up against a far-ranging, far deadlier enemy than America had ever faced in terms of terrorism, and that I knew, even though I came from the New York office, which prided itself on being, one of the flagship offices. I came from that office, but I knew clearly no one single field office could run the war against international terrorism. It was clear to me.
And that's the end of the interview. Don't forget to come back next week for part 2. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Ray with John O'Neill. You'll find FBI website articles and newspaper articles about the USS Cole bombing and 9/11 investigations, and newspaper articles and a video trailer about the Hulu series, The Looming Tower. And of course, you'll find a direct link to Ray's book, Endless Enemies, Inside FBI Counterterrorism. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I hope you share it with your friends, family, and associates. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast app, so that every Thursday morning it will magically appear on your device. This week, I was beta reading in advance for a friend's not yet published book. But next week, I'll have a crime fiction recommendation I can talk about. In the meantime, if you're looking for a good crime novel, I hope you'll consider Pay to Play, my crime thriller about a female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry. Available as an ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.